guys, Nick Jennison for Guitar Interactive. It is my pleasure to be sat with the legendary Marty Friedman, a man whose magnificent mid-90s haircut I spent most of my youth trying to emulate, unsuccessfully. Marty, thanks for taking the time to come and chat with us today. How are you doing?
Very nice to meet you, Nick. And I would say very, very successfully, because I always wanted my hair to be less kinky and more wavy. And it seems like that you've got that down over me. So I would say it's successful.
I'll do you a trade any day, any day. So Marty's joining us from Japan by way of San Francisco on the background. Marty, I want to talk to you about the new album. So we've had a chance to listen to Drama. It probably will be out by the time this interview drops. Everybody who's watching this will likely already have heard Illumination, which is the first single. First of all, got to say the whole thing sounds absolutely tremendous. It's very reminiscent, as you've rightly pointed out, reminiscent of Scenes. I think perhaps folks who are more familiar with your heavier work might be in for a pleasant surprise here. Do you want to tell us a little bit about how this album came about? Because it was kind of a pandemic project for you, if I'm right in remembering that.
It was after the pandemic. My previous album, Tokyo Jukebox 3, was a pandemic project.
Of course. My mistake.
And I've got to tell you, a pandemic project, I was so lucky. That was a breeze, because during the pandemic, nobody was working, and so you could just call anybody and they have as much time as you need. Oh, you need a keyboard player? I got 10 great players here. They're all out of work. And, you know what I mean? So it was a great period of time for casting. But this one I started in the spring, summer of 2022. And it was a very, very long process, but as you said, it's a little bit reminiscent of Scenes, but I don't like to really say that I am nostalgic about Scenes and I'm trying to recreate that in any way. But I will say that's probably the album that most people come up to me and say it means so much to them. And how can I not be affected by hearing that so much? So I tried to figure out what it is that I liked about that record, and tried to see how that related to me in 2024. And it turns out that what I really just want to do is have a piece of music that when you listen to it, you feel actually better than you did before you listened to it, like an uplifting feeling, or maybe a tear or goosebumps or a chill or some kind of emotional, even subliminal reaction. Sometimes like when you're watching, oftentimes in a classical concert where there's a piece of music, you don't even know why, but like for whatever reason, the music just is like takes you and moves you and like forces you to like have a chill or have a tear or something like that. I just love that feeling so much. It's not like because, wow, that solo is great, or because that arrangement is fantastic, or it's so loud, or sounds so beautiful. It's just some kind of undefinable thing about that piece of music, that little section, what came before it, what came after it, how it was built up to. Something about that particular piece of music was very, very therapeutic, and I'm so glad I came to this concert. So I tried to do an album of all that to the best of my ability. So whether I succeeded or not is really up to the listener. But as far as I'm concerned, that was the goal. And, I just think music is always there for you. You know what I mean? Sometimes when times are really hard and there's, you know, sometimes you depend on people and they're not there, or sometimes you don't have people to depend on. Sometimes it's music, and music is always there. And there's always this go-to piece of music. And I wanted to be that. I wanted to be that go-to piece of music for people. So that was the overall vibe there.
Well, as one of the fortunate early listeners, I can safely say mission accomplished. I think it's aptly described as a series of mini symphonies. But what I noticed from listening myself is it seems like you're drawing on lots of traditions of highly emotive music. So I'm hearing a lot of romantic era influences. There's some, dare I even say, some Baroque stuff, but it's kind of a dirty word in the guitar sphere because it has certain connotations about, maybe showiness or all that sort of thing. But there's also a lot of the traditional Japanese influences, which we'll talk to in a minute. But I wanted to ask you what you were listening to and what you were drawing on when you were composing this album.
Uh, when you're making a record, it's so much of a luxury to listen to anyone else's music.
Hmm. Yeah.
It, it's not something that you really draw so much out of. However, it's very common for me to hear like a melody or a motif somewhere in the background and just steal it.
Hmm.
That's common. I do that. Um,
Hmm.
in a restaurant, sometimes you'll hear a piece of music and there's just one little key change that you hear. I'm like, I've never done that before. That's really cool. Or I love the way this note sat over this chord and then the next chord negated that note, or whatever the little thing is. I do that all the time. And it could come from a piece of pop music, or often rhythmic things happen in Indian restaurants of all places where they're playing
Hmm.
Indian music, and they have very unique for Indian music it would be a cliche, but when you put that into like a pop context or rock, it
Hmm.
just sounds very unique. So I've done a lot of that, a lot of like nicking little parts that affected me and just outright stealing them,
Hmm.
only because by the time they're gone through my whole filter and the arrangement of the song, there's so little of that left in there that it really isn't really ripping off anymore. But I do that a lot. So there wasn't really any big outside influence that I
Hmm.
could point to that
I guess
much. No.
it's probably more a culmination of like I say, a lifetime of listening and playing and composing. And I guess it hits on a broader point about what is it to steal when so much music has existed for so long. I guess it's more about who's saying it and what you're saying with the musical building blocks that have
Well,
come
yeah,
before us. Yeah.
absolutely, absolutely. And I think um, stealing was what we all do as collectors of vocabulary on our
Mm.
instruments and collectors of musical vocabulary anyway.
Mm.
And what I love to find in other people's music, and I love to put in my music, is little moments of familiarity. I can't
Mm.
L's and R's have become completely Japanese. I can't say a word like familiarity anymore. It's so weird. But little moments of maybe you heard that in a lullaby as a child, or maybe it was a
Mm.
pop song when you were like 10 years old. Little twists and turns in melodies that somehow feel familiar, but
Mm.
you can't, it's not like ripping off Hey Jude or something like that.
Mm.
It's like just some melody that you might have heard on a B side of a single when you were 10,
Mm.
but it's still in there because I think everything that you've ever heard is stored in there somewhere. And everything that you ever heard is like connected to some kind of life experiences. Some are stronger than others. I know you have the same thing,
Mm.
Nick, as I do. Sometimes you'll hear a song and you'll remember I was in the car driving home from my graduation when this song was playing. You'll have a specific memory of a song and a place
Mm.
and all that. But those are the easy ones. But in our lives, there's so many more that we can't put our finger on that are equally embedded in our bodies. And when I bring those things out to people, I feel
Mm.
like that's when they get the chills and stuff. That's when I get them.
Mm.
When I hear someone else's music, why am I responding? Why do I feel anything when I'm hearing another piece of music? It's probably because there's a deep connection with um, somewhere in my earlier life, when teens are like really emotional changes going on in life or whatever. So there's probably a lot of recognizable little motifs in my music. It's not, what do you call, it's not eclectic. I wouldn't call
Mm.
my music eclectic at all. I think
Mm.
it's very easy to get into, and there's a lot of familiarity in
Mm,
it, but not like blatant, this song sounds like this song, this like that. There's just little musical motifs that are might even be somewhat common, but all going through my filter and all going through my life experiences and the sound of my fingers playing, which
mm,
has its own, its own agenda. So by the
mm.
time you hear it, you think, wow, it sounds like Marty, but really what it is, it's like kind of a collection of all the subliminal music that I've heard growing up and to this day.
Mm. No, I mean that's a really great way of describing it, but also it hits on a broader point that uh it's trying to chase that experiential thing of, can I communicate something deeper than here's a cool collection of notes to an audience? And I guess that starts with I can't remember who it was. I think it was Herbie Hancock said something along the lines of, it was the question of, does music belong to the player or the listener? And I think the quote was, it belongs to the listener, but the musician is the first listener. So I guess it starts with touching on those experiences of your own and then communicating through music. Again, mission accomplished with that very much. But I also wanted to take this opportunity to kind of touch on a subject that has been pretty hot in the press right now, which is the guitar solo needing to go away. Now, I feel like you've kind of been done a bit of a disservice here in terms of the headlines surrounding that quote. What I took from this was a need for the guitar solo or the guitar as an instrumental voice to evolve into something bigger than, here is the 8-bar solo to get us from this chorus to this next verse. Can you tell us a bit more about your thoughts on that subject, and maybe we'll clarify a bit? Maybe we'll get some new headlines, some more accurate ones.
Well, Guitar World was very, very gentlemanly in clearing the whole entire thing up. When you said it was a hot topic, nothing could be farther from the truth. As you know, what happens in this crazy world is you could be doing an interview about something that's very important to you, a project that you worked really hard on. I don't remember what the interview was. It might have been talking about this album. Um,
Mm,
and in just absolutely a random comment taken completely out of context, that's the headline.
mm,
If the subject was just talking about guitar solos, I wouldn't have taken the time out of the day to do the interview in the first
of
place.
course.
It's
Yeah.
not a topic. It's not a
Mm,
topic. And in this particular case, um, stuff getting taken out of context is one thing, has nothing to do about that. But in this case, I was completely misquoted. I
mm,
did not say those things that you're talking about. And we got down to the bottom of the issue, and it was apparently whatever I said was recorded and transcribed electronically, not
mm,
by hand, and all kinds of things that I didn't say. Couple words were twisted, making the meanings exactly the opposite of what I said. And
mm,
it was just, I didn't usually don't care about that stuff, but in this case, it made me look like a very negative person. So I actually took the energy to call them out call Guitar World
mm,
out on this, and they were very, very cool about doing something to clear it up for everybody. So I was impressed by
mm,
them. You know, everybody was cool, everything is cool, and to clear up the whole thing, I've always been, you know, I'm a walking freaking guitar solo. So I
mm,
definitely don't want them to die any kind of deaths.
mm,
The closest thing to that comment is I always want to see a new and unique presentation and interpretation of guitar solos,
mm,
different structures, different melodic motifs, different placements in the songs, different tonalities, different sounds, stuff that's going to keep the guitar solo fresh.
mm,
Guitars are going to live forever for the main reason is because they're just so damn fun to play. You
mm,
know, whether they're trendy in the top 10 of the chart or not, it doesn't matter because people are going to always want to play this thing that's so fun, and you can feel the progress and you can feel yourself expressing yourself through this instrument. It's
Mm,
never going to go away, but it is going to go in and out of fashion in the charts. But it's never going to go away. So the point is for it to come back into fashion, more innovative things have to keep happening. And I just hope that that happens because the more the guitar solos are in fashion, the more us players of guitar solos will be faced with having to do more innovative things, and the whole thing will just be better and better. So that's what I
mm,
was trying to say, but it was probably just a 2, 3 line comment in a
mm.
whole other interview about something completely unrelated. Um, so that's the end of that,
For
really.
sure. I mean, when I read the articles in depth beyond the strap line, that's certainly what I took from it. From what you were saying was the guitar has always been an instrument that's been about pushing sonic and musical boundaries because it's such a young instrument comparatively. I mean, maybe not so much now, but during the you know the rock and roll era, the sort of the music that I grew up listening to, it was all about what can we do with this cool instrument and how can we continue pushing it. And that's kind of what I took from what you were saying, for sure. I wanted to ask you about that regarding people doing exciting things with the guitar. So obviously you're continuing to push musical boundaries both in your own musicianship and in your collaborations with other players. But I wanted to ask you about some players that you're excited about. So are there any new players who you're really digging, who maybe our listeners should check out?
Yeah, I'm sure if you're watching this on YouTube or wherever on the net you're watching it, you've probably heard of Ichikanito.
Mm,
And he is just a super musician. And, people look at him and they see the technique and they think, wow, he's got super technique, which is true. But what is so cool about him is more his musicality with using that technique. You
mm,
know, ever since the beginning of time, there have been guys with unbelievable technique that when you watch the guy, you go, wow, that's really cool. I wish I could do that. For me, those type of guys, the entertainment wore off when I was about 17 years
mm,
old. Um, then it comes down to how much am I actually enjoying the music that's coming out of this?
mm,
And then once you realize that you, as the listener, are more enjoying the music that you really enjoy rather than just saying wow at someone's technique,
mm,
then you start to grasp music better. And what happens is, as you certainly know, and all of us guitarists know, when we're first starting for our first 2 or 3 years, 1 or 2 years maybe, when we see another dude play something that we can't do,
mm,
and it looks like there ain't no way we're ever going to be able to do that. That's all we can see. And we're just like, this guy's a god. How I can't comprehend it. And it's so impressive. But then we're too young and too stupid to realize that we wouldn't be listening to this music if it weren't for the fact that we were blown away by what his fingers are doing.
mm,
You've got to stop and think, what does this music do for me regardless of the technique, because every single musician and every piece of music has their own music down to a specialty. And then they're all super technicians in their own way. They all
mm,
are. So if it's down to finger dexterity, that's kind of a pretty thin way to judge the type of music that you like.
mm,
So I really want to urge people to go a little bit beyond that. I know it's hard for beginning guitarists to get over that, but once you get over that, you start to understand your own playing even more. And your own playing is not just about being able to do hard shit that other people can
mm,
do better than you can. Your own playing is about how to express that music that's inside of you. Because if you are so excited about music that you want to buy a guitar and actually learn how to play the damn thing, it's so friggin' hard. There's got to be some music inside of you that you need to get out. So
mm.
it's not about just because I want to play hard shit that other people can do. It's more about my own individual music. Every single person has their own individual music. And then when you stop chasing these technique guys, you can focus on your own individual thing and make that its own technique within itself and make that its own music. And this was a long answer to your short question, but the thing about Ichkanito is he does both of those things at the same time.
Hmm.
He's like one of the few guys who's got this massive, massive, just unbelievable technique. But when he writes pieces of music, the musicality is very appealing to me, and he's not afraid of doing long pieces of music that are not show off pieces. It's
Hmm.
just his music that's inside of him. And you gotta know another thing, if someone's doing show off things all the time, that's all they got.
Hmm.
It's like that's really all they got. So like at the end of the day, music is deeper than that. Music,
Hmm.
sometimes you show off, sometimes you don't. Sometimes it's hot, sometimes it's cold. Different emotions. Any type of wonderful music has so many a different big palette of emotions. So the reason why I like Ichka is because he does all of that stuff, and it's not um it's impressive to people who want to be impressed, but it's also very musical on an emotional and just plain music that I enjoy level. So that's very
Hmm.
rare for me to come up with an answer because most hot
Hmm.
guitar
Hmm.
players are just doing shit that I can't play, and I just get frustrated watching these guys. But I'm always looking for little sparks of things that draw
Hmm.
me into their music. And once you get past being blown away by the technique, so Ichika
Hmm.
is one of those guys. So I recommend him.
Can confirm. It's interesting. I became aware of Ichika through my students, who were coming to me with their phones and going, "Have you seen this?" And I'm watching it, going, "I've never seen anyone play like that ever. This is unbelievable." But more than anything, it seems to have spawned its own subgenre of guitar playing, which some people will refer to as Ichika, not just as the player, but also as an onomatopoeia for the sound, the kind of muted strokes thing. And there are so many players who are kind of following in his footsteps, I guess. So it's really interesting that there are these pivotal guitar players who maybe we'll remember in 10 years' time as the little mini Hendrixes of their own musical movements. At the same time, the same students are also coming to me and going, "How do I play Tornado of Souls?" I'm like, right, well, I'll figure that out. So there is all of this great music that you've put out over the decades now that is still standing the test of time. But it's really interesting to see the evolution of your playing from those early breakout those breakout tracks with Cacophony through into Megadeth, and then into all the stuff you've been doing for the last 20 correct me wrong, it's 21 years that you've been living in Japan. You left Megadeth in 2000, if I'm right. It's
I
2003.
left in 2000 and I came here in like 2002. So it's like
Yeah,
22 years.
22 years.
Yeah.
I wanted to chat to you about that musical evolution a little bit. So a friend of mine, we were chatting about this because I was really excited to about doing this interview. When it came across my desk, I'm like, oh sweet, this is gonna be one for the bucket list for me, right? It's gonna be and we were sort of talking about the musical path you've taken. I did want to talk to you about the way you played in Cacophony versus the way you played in Megadeth, and how much of that evolution was down to just kind of becoming a little older and a little more experienced, or how much of it was down to the environment that you were in and wanting to fit the band's aesthetic, and maybe even some external input from Dave, who we know is very hands on with his musicians. Talk to us a little bit about that journey in your playing, and then we'll talk more about the stuff that came later.
Interesting. I haven't thought about that in a while, but it's probably worth talking about. Um, in Cacophony was like I had the opportunity to find the limits of my guitar playing and then also find a guy in Jason Becker who is able to harmonize with me live. So when you have that kind of limitless limitless environment, you just come up with a lot of stuff. And I would say the vast majority of it, I was really proud of it. And I haven't heard a lot of that in years, but some of that was definitely the result and the product of just, fuck it, we have all this shit we can do. Let's do as much as we can. And if it were now, I would have probably gone back and said, well, this is not going to endear us to anybody other than like the 0.000 of people who can understand that we're playing fives against a 17 over six crazy musical shit that we
Mm.
had just learned from. There was this book called what was it called? It was the Thesaurus of Musical. I'm sure some of your students know it.
Mm.
Musical sequences or something like that. This it was like the
Mm.
all-knowing book of everything, and it had all of these intense guitar. They weren't made for guitar lines. They were just sequences, and we
Mm.
would learn these things and play shit that would just blow each other's minds and say, "Yeah, that's cool. Let's put it in." When you grow up, you realize that's not the criteria of making music that is going to bring out the emotions in people. But
Mm.
that was the music of two guys who were just so excited about finding kindred spirits with each other and just going completely apeshit and pushing the
Mm.
other guy to go further. I would do something and Jason would be like, "What the fuck is that?" And then he would do it. And then he'd do something cooler than that. And then I go, "Holy shit. Oh, let me beat that." And we'd like be like friendly competition. And then the
Mm.
next thing you know, the song has got like five harmonies and they're all playing in different keys with each other. But it's cool if you understand the theory of it. Well, no, we
Mm.
barely understand the theory of it. So there was that. It was just really, really insane. I loved every minute of it. But when I joined Megadeth, it was a different atmosphere completely. Um, and when you say Mustaine was hands-on, he was very hands-on when it came to rhythm guitar,
Mm.
way more than I expected. And learning how to play like his rhythm playing was the biggest challenge for me in Megadeth. But when it
Mm.
came to leads, he wasn't in the studio. I wasn't. I was the only one there with the engineer, and oftentimes the producer wasn't even there at the beginning. So it was just me, like on the first Megadeth album, it was just me and the engineer. Of course, I
Mm.
played everything for everybody when I finished, but there was really no input when it came to solos.
Mm.
But if you look at the song structures in Megadeth compared to Cacophony, the main difference is they're just plain songs. They're not
Mm.
vehicles for us to showcase some really incredibly unique soloing concept that we just came up with.
Mm.
They were songs, and here's your section to put a solo in the
Mm.
song. And therein lies the responsibility because when you're in Megadeth, we're like a very quote unquote progressive band, but there wasn't a whole lot of odd time signatures and there
Mm.
wasn't a whole lot of like dissonance and there wasn't a whole lot of unusual harmony intervals. It was very straight ahead. Um,
Mm.
and you have to also remember it was at a time in music where guitar solos were out of fashion. They were
Mm.
very out of fashion. Um, Nirvana was just about to come in and wipe kind of ornate guitar solos off the map for a while. We were
Mm.
very lucky to stay kind of over the radar with that in Megadeth. But the main thing I remember adjusting was caring about things like lyrics and where the vocals end before the solo and where the vocals come back in and what I can do to make this part of the song identifiable from other
Mm,
Megadeth songs. Like when you hear one Megadeth song, you hear the solo, you know that's the solo of that song.
mm,
Sometimes when you listen to guitar players, especially guitar players doing fancy stuff, you could accuse them of having any solo be interchangeable with any song. It's just
mm,
a bunch of fast shit that's cool sounding for that moment. I remember
mm,
as a kid, I'd listen to the Kiss songs, and even with Ace's vocabulary being what it was, you could hear the solo and right away identify what song that was. And to
mm.
me, that's much more valuable than having a much wider vocabulary. So I'm like, well, I have this relatively wide vocabulary. How am I going to make every song sound different? That was the main thought difference between Megadeth and Cacophony.
I mean, it's really interesting you say that, specifically the part about being alone in the studio for that. Now, that is particularly fascinating because of that era of bands, in the Big Four and Big Four adjacent. You found that a lot of players were doing their best work in terms of crafting these solos that are songs within themselves when they were being produced, let's say, when they had some external input. So it's fascinating that you've sat there and you've kind of come out with these solos that are little mini symphonies, all in your lonesome with the engineer, and then have turned them over to perhaps the most critical. I guess the most discerning of the musicians from that era, and he's gone. Yep, that's great. Well done. So that is super super cool.
I'm so
But
flattered to hear you say that. And please don't get me wrong. I prefer to be produced. It makes the deciding project process much easier. And in other Megadeth records, Dave was more present, and the producer, like Max Norman, was uber present. He was always there, and I love a different set of ears that I respect to be in there. First of all, you don't second guess yourself. You get a reaction right away. Love that. And even on my solo records on Drama, I produced it myself,
Mhm.
but my technician, well, I don't want to say technician, he's actually a master luthier and master guitar maintainer, just knows
Oh wow.
everything about the instrument, but is also a very musical person named Franco Piona.
Mm,
He was there basically. I would play a melody, or I'd play a solo or a rhythm part or anything, and he'd say, okay, now that I know what part you're going to play, I'm going to get you this guitar and this amp to play it with. That was the
mm,
process. And at the same time, he was also a musical ear,
mm,
so I would play something. Sometimes I like crazy shit, and he'd laugh at it, and I'm like, "What are you laughing at? Is something funny
mm,
about that?" And he's like, "Well, this sounds kind of funny here. I don't know." And then give me. I love other opinions in the studio. I'm definitely not
mm,
the kind of guy who prefers to be alone in there and
mm,
just bang it out. But I'm just saying, when the first Megadeth album, it
mm,
was that way. I was alone, and everything after that, a different kind of connect. Comp Can't think in English, my friend. Different combination.
yeah.
You talk music in Japanese all day, and then all of a sudden you got to
Mm.
speak in English. But it's
That's they say you are fully
combination.
immersed in a new language when you start thinking in that language, though. So they say that's what they say.
What's
They
that?
say they say when you say you are fully immersed in when you learn a second language, when you start to think in that language over. So when you start to think in Japanese rather than thinking in English, that's how you know you're a Japanese speaker. Apparently, this is what I've heard. I am a filthy monoglot, so I've
Oh, it's so true, but it's also the environment. I think if I were in America doing this interview, it would come a little bit easier. But like the air left and right of me is all Japan. Had Japanese food. I just ate Japanese food for lunch. It's a Japanese world. I'm thinking in Japanese. I just had a meeting in Japanese, and all of a
wow.
sudden, yeah, I'm not that great at switching. So
Mm.
it's an interesting problem that I have. But
Uh, yeah.
yeah, I love being produced, and I love it when
Mm.
I get a session and the producer is very musical and they come up with ideas, and then I run with that. So I would
Mm.
probably actually prefer being produced. So when you mentioned other guys doing
Mm.
well with producers, I think that's the reason. And I think when going back to Ace Frehley and Kiss, you got guys like Bob Ezrin and Eddie Kramer in there kind of
Mm.
directing traffic. And I think those guys are both very much song guys. And I
Mhm.
think that's part of the reason why we got very memorable solos from the Kiss era.
I mean, yeah, I mean, Kiss, Ace Frehley is one of those touchstone guys for those super memorable solos. Like he's like kind of a Brian May in that regard, where you can pull out any solo from the Kiss catalog. You know what song it's from. You pretend if you know the band, you know what era it's from. It's a great comparison, man. I actually wanted to talk to you a little bit about. Funny enough, you mentioned that about the guitars and about Franco's influence. That's actually hitting a few questions that I have. First of all, was I noticed he was listed on the album credits as guitar technician, and it's quite rare that you'll see that listed on album credits at all. In addition to his other roles in the band, but also I noticed that the album was done in part in Italy, as in addition to being recorded in Japan. I wanted to ask about the decision to record in Italy, but I guess you kind of answered that already. But I did want to pick you on the guitars thing because it's been mentioned that this is one of the first times you've been experimenting with vintage guitars. I know you as somebody who plays very modern instruments, and you know there are certain instrument styles that I associate you with. What was the deal with the vintage guitars on this album and the vintage amplifiers, and what was it that you were using? And was there any that you really connected with? Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, as you say, I've always been a modern instrument guy. Um, I love dependable gear that always works and never ever lets me down. And
Mm.
my stuff is just workhorses, man. Those
Mm.
Jacksons, you can throw them out of an airplane and they come out in tune and rocking, and there's a lot of great tonal options, and they're just so good. It's like
Mm.
I never really thought I needed to use other guitars. And plus compounded with sometimes you do things where like, dude, check out this guitar. It's like a $50,000 strap from the
Mm.
50s, and Eric Clapton wants own this and whatever. And you play the thing's a beater. Thing is like it's like it buzzes, it doesn't stay in tune. You plug it in, it makes noise. I'm like, dude, this is probably why Eric Clapton doesn't own it now, because it's just like an old guitar. When that kind of thing happens a
Mhm.
bunch of times, you just thought, well, that's for collectors, and I understand the
Mm.
historical value to those guitars.
Mm.
But when that turned around for me was I one day was at my friend Franco's house in Italy, and he's got probably the most beautiful and well-maintained collection of vintage guitars I've ever seen. And I was playing a guitar. It was one of the mid 50s Strats, late 50s Strats, through a Fender Twin Reverb, and I'm just randomly playing it. And my wife was there, and I was just randomly playing, and a tear came out of her eye while I was playing.
Mm.
We were just in a living room, but it sounded like a cathedral. It was just such a beautiful sound that I'd never heard before. And just in a casual setting, it wasn't a studio, it wasn't a room, with wood floors or anything. It was just a regular living room, just playing. I played like a very simple little phrase on that. It was just rang in such a way that I'd never had at my fingertips before.
Mm.
And kind of like a light bulb went off. And I talked to Frank. I'm like, someday I would love to record an album with your guitars and your expertise. And he said, I'd love to do it. And
Mm.
so getting our schedules to match up was the hardest part. So that took a couple years before we could make that happen. But we did. And in two trips, I did one trip in 2022 to Italy to record guitars. And then I came back last year to record the rest of the guitars all in like November of 2023. And I did all of the guitars in Italy, and the majority was vintage guitars, and I had my own modern guitars and amps, my
Mm.
Angle amps and my Jacksons, and those sat in their places really, really nice and a nice contrast to the other guitars and amps that I used, vintage amps. I would have never ever considered it, but it's in the maintenance. It's in the maintenance. If you got guys who maintain these vintage guitars, they're not just old pieces of shit. They're
Mm,
these wonderful gems with a lot of new music in them waiting to be made. Beautiful new
mm,
sounds that we are not used to hearing, especially in the era of simulators,
mm,
which simulators are also a great part of the palette as well. And I did
mm,
use them some on the record. But I found this new appreciation to well-maintained vintage guitars
mm,
that totally negates everything I thought of before and
mm,
completely set me on a new path. So I have a new respect for vintage guitars and what they can allow me to use them for in my music. So it's
mm.
just been a very learning experience, so to speak.
You've hit the nail on the head with the well-maintained thing. It's like an old motorcycle. You know, if you have an old motorcycle and it's been loved and looked after, it's a wonderful thing. Or an old leather jacket, you know, one of those sort of trips. What is very interesting that you've said there about the experience of recording the guitars with Franco is I've immediately seen a parallel to the way you spoke about writing music with Jason Becker as two guys in a room who are making music for the love of the instrument, but it's finding things the instrument can do from a totally different perspective. From let's put together this combination of player, amp, guitar, room. Was that something you were aware of, or is that how it felt?
It
Maybe,
was the
or
first time
yeah.
very, very aware of. It was the first time I've ever recorded this way. Usually, the way I record is, of course, all of my guitar techs are world class guys who know their shit very well.
Mm,
But I'm a get in and get the hell out type of
mm,
guy. The tech goes in.
mm,
Say, this is the type of tones we're going to want to go for today. The tech will
mm,
go in, dial up them with the engineer, pick out guitars, usually five or six. I go in there and play it. And it's always 9 times out of 10, it's the sound I want. It's perfect. Let's go.
mm,
Um, and we're done. This time, every single phrase, whether it be a solo, a rhythm, uh, ad lib, a melody, a harmony, every single phrase, I would play it once, and then Franco would go, okay, in this time, you need a Gretsch 62 Super Chet for this, and
mm,
some other amp. And he's got all of these modern amps and ancient amps and amps that he's built himself. He knows this gear and he knows the mics and all of those things that I've never given the slightest shit about before,
mm,
just because I don't have that talent and I never thought about it. But every single guitar part was played probably 10 times before we got on the magic of the
mm,
sound. And during those 10 times, I was refining the parts as well and getting them better under my fingers. So by the time we got it real, I was like playing the stuff like an old master by then. Usually
mm,
I get lucky into little phrases and, oh, that's killer. I got lucky. But when you play the same thing 10 times, you play with a different sense of purposeful. It's like you
mm,
playing it on purpose. It's
mm,
not a lucky accident anymore. And you've made all the edges, the nuances exactly the way you want them to be. You know how it is sometimes, like when you get a lucky ass take
mhm,
and they just, hey, you're so lucky, you're so happy with it, and you just go with it.
mm.
It was like that, but like you get the lucky ass take, but then Franco will say, well, we should do this with a different guitar. And I'm like,
Oh,
fuck, it's so good.
that's
I just want
yeah,
to
yeah.
leave this, do the different guitar, trust me. And then when you do with that other guitar, you take the little parts of that lucky ass take and you fix the other parts that were just okay. So you remembered the thing that you did that was lucky. You do that like you really mean it. And then you like, you polish the edges of the other things at the same
Mm,
time. And by the time you're done with it, you're glad you did the extra work. I mean, it was very much a lot of extra work, and but having him there to force me to do that extra work made it so much more enjoyable when I'm mixing the record. So I have him to
mm.
thank completely for that.
Well, I mean, you guys have come up with something really, really magical here. Because I was listening to the whole album. I've listened to it three times through now. I listened to it when it came through. I listened to it last night before I went to bed, and again this morning. And something that I was struck by was, among other things, was just how great every every phrase sounds in terms of its execution. And I've sat kind of scratching my head and I'm going, I could probably play most of this stuff, but I don't think it would sound like that. There's something in the nuance, and it's every note. It's not like one of these things where you get like magical moments in an album. Every phrase is played so beautifully, and I guess now that we've heard the experience of making the album, it speaks to that attention to detail from both of you. Another thing that I wanted to touch on that struck me again about the album was the familiarity and the pop. There are some pop sounds in there, but it's a uniquely Japanese pop vocabulary. Now, having done a little bit of J-pop myself through an artist that I've worked with, something that always struck me was the harmonic density of Japanese pop music when compared to Western pop music. And there are parallels to some eras of Western contemporary music, but it's very much its own thing. For our listeners who might not be familiar with this, can you talk to us a little bit about Japanese pop music, the harmony, I guess the conventions might not be the right word, but you know what I'm trying to say here. Can you tell us a little bit about that and its influence on this album?
Yeah, well, you having experience in it, you probably really understand the difference.
Mm.
Um, I think the easiest, depending on how technical your listeners want to get,
Mm.
um, we as Americans, you're in Britain,
Yes.
okay?
Mhm.
American people, and to some extent UK people as well, grew up with a certain palette of rock music
Mm.
that kind of built into wherever we are now with hard rock and heavy metal, and everything is kind of what we grew up with was a
Mm.
natural extension to what we have now.
Mm.
Japanese people grew up with a completely different vocabulary of music. And so therefore, what their music has evolved into was like two different branches of two different trees.
Mm.
Um, and and just as this, you could say the same thing about Indian music is a better
Mm.
example. Indian music, if you listen to like Bollywood type of music,
Mm.
that's not
Mm.
stuff that comes out of growing up out of blues and rock and roll and Chuck Berry and all that stuff.
Mm.
That comes from cultural music that builds in cultural time signatures, cultural scale movements, cultural phrasing, slurs and slides and interpretations. So in Japanese, the easiest, simplest comparison is the basic chords are more dense than what we grew up in America.
Mm.
American rock music and all that heavy metal started off like with a 1-4-5 blues,
Mm.
major chords and maybe a minor chord, seventh chord or whatever, those type of chords.
Mm.
In Japanese, the pop music, um, a lot of the pop music, believe it or not, was influenced by a period of time in American pop music, the mid 70s, where there was a lot of what I call like adult baby jazz chords, like kind of
Yeah.
jazz 101s, like minor sevenths, major sevenths, uh, flat minor, what do you call it? I'm not a good with names, but what's that chord? B minor, minor seven, flat
Flat
five. That's a
five.
big one in
Yeah.
Japanese music. Minor
Mm.
seven, flat fives, and and um and on chords like you've got a G in the bass but F on the top.
Mm.
Those chords were rampant in 70s American pop. Stuff like Tony Orlando and Dawn and the Carpenters and
Mm.
all that kind of stuff. So rather than blues being a lift-off point for pop music, it feels almost like Japanese pop music got lifted off from like 70s um, and even stuff like David Foster, like when Chicago became a really pop band, not the
Mm.
horn Chicago. I'm talking about Chicago with the expensive chords
Hmm.
and at Peter Cetera and You're My Inspiration and those big chords.
Yeah, yeah.
That's where Japanese pop comes from. So you take the Japanese pop, but you add Japanese traditional music like, Japanese uh, minyo, which is I can't think in English anymore, the people's music of Japan,
Hmm.
traditional music, shamisen, koto, and all of the ancient music that's come down from generations. You mix that with the 70s chord structure
Mm.
thought process, like all of the one-hit wonders in the 70s, those chord progressions, plus traditional Japanese music, bam, and that's what you have
Mm.
even in heavy music of Japanese music, when it's heavy, dark, and crazy loud, those
Mm.
chord structures and those Japanese motifs are still strong, very, very strong in the top 10 today.
That is super interesting. That's a connection I've never made. But now that you've said it, 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 it I can see it super clearly. It is that it's the 70s harmonic vocabulary, but with, like you said, drawing on the traditional music, which has a lot of parallels to not necessarily the vocabulary, but similar parallels to the traditional British music that we have, maybe like Celtic music and Welsh music, and certainly it's folk traditions from around the world, but also with the, uh, I guess, with the more modern aesthetics from the 80s until now. That's absolutely fascinating. And we haven't heard that. We haven't heard a lot of very modern sounding music with this, like I say, mid-century 70s vocabulary. I actually did want to pick your brains on something to do with this. I'm gonna have to grab a guitar because I wanted to chat to you about an interval. It sounds really silly, but there's a thing that we I hope you don't mind me putting in the spot like this. I'm not going to ask you to go grab a fiddle, but there's an interval, a series of intervals that me and my friends refer to as the Marty Friedman second, and it's this guy. Hopefully, you can hear this. Maybe a little quiet, but it's the where are we? It's this guy where it's neither a minor nor a major second.
I can't hear it. Can you play
You can't
louder?
hear it. I will play. Oh, that is. I'm putting that on my resume. Marty Friedman asked me to play louder. Uh,
Yeah, I did.
so it's these kind of intervals. So where it's
I,
not quite a. I'm not going to play anymore, but it's not quite.
I
It's not
understand. I
quite on the
understand.
grid.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Where did they come from? And in your playing, and how would you recommend that our guys who are listening to this, who maybe want a piece of that, where should they be listening to go and get that into their own playing?
All right. Before we do that, to make it easier, can you pick up your guitar again and I'll
Happy
tell
to.
you how to play it?
Happy to, please. Yeah. I did.
Yeah.
I should be
Play
paying you for
that one
this.
more time.
Sure. So I'm
Play it one
playing.
more time, please.
Yeah, no problem.
One more? Oh, okay. Oh, I see what you're doing now. Okay,
Yeah.
that's interesting. That's interesting.
Well, we call
Yeah,
that the Marty Friedman second. That's a little colloquialism we have in my little group of guitar buddies. Like, oh, you did the Marty Friedman
right. Well,
second.
it definitely is, and it definitely is, and I've done a lot of that. And what you're basically doing, if you're in the key of E there, it sounds very Japanese.
Yeah.
If your key in, if your chord is A, it has a different tonality. And the main thing that's happening here is you're ending on an F sharp. So
Mm.
where does F sharp fit in within the chord in the background?
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
now, I'll tell you where, what I do this as a habit. Sometimes guitar players have
Mm.
habits. Um, what I might have done is I would have, when I first started doing this, I'm always trying to play normal licks in a way that
Mm.
other guys don't play it.
Mhm.
Because, like, everybody does to some extent the same things,
Mm.
but it's kind of every person's responsibility to change it a little bit because it's
Mm.
very easy to change anything. You
Yeah.
don't have to do it the same way as you learned it from someone else. It just takes one little thing to change it. So, for example, you do the exact same thing, but it's hard to do this without a guitar. And
Yeah.
um, let me see if I can give you something of value. Um, this is how to do it. This is the purpose of you're playing on your note is F sharp is your target note, right? So coming from an F to an F sharp, depending how long you want the person to hear that F is important. If you do that, a lot of people when they quote unquote mimic my playing, they'll stay on that F forever and go. It's like it's overdoing it. It's overdoing it. When I do those type of things, usually it's a whole lot more subtle, but to people's ears, that's all they hear. They think, "Oh my God, he's playing this note that's so out of key. I can't believe it." But really, the only note I really care about in this particular thing is the F sharp. So bending it from using your second finger like that, you have a lot of expression that you can do. You can shake it there, or you can go up another half step to the G there, or it's just a nice way to get to F sharp. You usually, when people hold a note, they get to it from a whole step below. A half step is a little bit more, it gives you more leeway to express that note with vibratos. Usually what happens is you bend up a whole step and you can go down, but it's hard to go up without sounding sharp. So
Yeah.
when you're using your second finger like that, you got a lot more leeway both ways to do many different kinds of expressive vibratos. But what I would like to draw your attention to this on, Nick, is this is a concept that like I probably done to death like 20 years ago. Over the last maybe 10 years, I've been trying to do something that takes this one step further and getting away with it royally. And the best example of this is there's a song. Jackson did an ad campaign last summer. I think it came out in the fall for it's called an American Virtuoso Jackson guitar.
I know the ones.
And it was
Yeah.
very cool. Misha from Periphery wrote the song, and he and I and all these different people did solos in this song. In this song, I made it a point to hold on to the notes that everybody hates and hold on to those notes in a way that people will not hate them anymore. You know what I'm saying? So
Yeah,
like
I totally do.
holding on to a minor second, chords a major chord, it's E major or whatever it is. I'm sitting on that F like it's the coolest note in the world and selling that. And the reason why this works, to me anyways, if you analyze pop music and stuff like I was talking about, those 70s one-hit wonders and Tony Orlando and all that shit that you don't
Yeah, yeah.
really think about, often the vocal melodies have a half step above the chord that they're talking about. If like the chord's E, he's singing like a F E over it or something, or it's like a diminished, it's an F diminished for a second over an E. It's very poppy. Like even in the 1930s, those pop songs where people wearing derby hats and shit, they're always sitting on the minor second. And I'm like songs like You Are My Sunshine or something, songs like that type of songs, they always have these minor seconds in it. Why is a minor second so illegal? It shouldn't be. In Cacophony, we did some of that, but it sounded so noisy back then. But I tried to like put it in a pop context, and that's what that is. So like if you want to really dig deep into the concept that you brought out, which is very important in phrasing, I would say go one step further and sit on minor seconds, sit on flat fives, sit on flat sixes. I find that's the hardest one.
Sure.
Flat six, like a C over an E. If the chord is like that, but that's where a lot of my playing goes, and it's It's like it's kind of sad that I have such like a perverted sense of playing, but that's the type of stuff that I really get excited about and trying to make people listen to those things. It's really pop, but it sounds really dissonant, but I'm doing it in a heavy metal context because these are all the music that I love, and I'm just kind of like fucking it all together.
Hmm.
When I can talk to someone like you who can understand that, I get a kick out of that.
Oh, I appreciate that, man. That's very kind of you to say. I mean, I get a huge kick out of listening to it and trying to pull a bit of that out in my own playing is what little I can do of it. And it's really fascinating that you're saying that it comes from pop music because my immediate thought was, okay, there's going to be either a Japanese or an Arabic influence to this or something. There's going to be some kind of non-Western route to this, but ultimately it's 70s and 30s pop music. That's crazy, man. Like that is not something I expected you to say, but I feel like we're our listeners and myself we're going to go on a deep dive into into Chicago and look for the Marty Friedman parallels. But
Yeah, well, not so much Chicago, but like listen to the
yeah, yeah,
one-hit
yeah.
wonders of the 70s
Mhm.
and the great songwriters and all that.
Mm.
But of course, especially in the Cacophony days, I ripped off so many licks from like Arabic music and Indian music, and I've done some couple collaborations with Indian artists that have just been so mind-blowing. And if your listeners are interested, go check out Pineapple Express from India. That will just completely set you on a rabbit hole of doom as far as interesting things. Unbelievable. Done a lot of research into that and just skimming off little parts of that. But like all of that, like progressive stuff, if you go into like ultra prog music, like stuff that was heavily influenced by Holdsworth, you're going to get into a lot of musical concepts that are way deeper than anything I can even go into. But I like to take these little concepts and find ways to fit them into my music where it means something to my music, not just because it's musically cool,
Yeah.
but just because for some reason it spoke to me. But yeah, it's fun, and I love to be able to talk about it in the rare instances that I can because it's kind of a niche talk there.
Oh man, all our guys, we grew up we grew up listening to the music that you were putting out and listening to a lot of the same music that I'd imagine you were listening to growing up. So we're really this is stuff that our viewers are really into. And myself personally, from a selfish perspective, I just want to know. So I'm like, well, look, I got an hour with Marty. I'm gonna ask him. Speaking of which, we are being very greedy with your time. You've been super generous today, Marty. I've got one last question for you before we let you go. So as the cultural ambassador for Japan Heritage, and when we ask you about guitar players that you love, you mentioned Ichika Naito. I wanted to ask you. We ask guitar players a lot about putting together a fictional G3. So we know the G3 business. It's Joe Satriani's baby project, and he'll bring two guitar players together. I wanted to put a twist on this and ask you to put together a J3. So you are putting together your ideal tour, three guitar players, but we're going to limit it to Japanese guitar players. You're allowed
It's
to
funny
include
that you
yourself.
say that because
Yeah.
I've done just that. I've done it.
Yeah.
Um, I've done it, and we called it Guitar Monsters, Guitar Monsters Japan, and we did. Udo promoted it just like a foreign tour. It was myself, it was Ichika, and it was Takayoshi Omura from he's got his own band and he played with Baby Metal and he played in my band for 8 years. Um, and that was a fantastic, fantastic run tour. But like thing with that G3, any combination is going to be magic. I can't think of any. These three guys would be the ultimate. I would be happy to play on any bill like that, and I'm appealing to Satriani and Steve Vai right now. I'm saying this. I would love to be a part of their thing. I guessed it on their G3 in Japan once a while back, and I would be honored to be a part of that. But I think any combination they're all great. There's so many guitar players with different voices out there, and it's interesting to watch people do their thing, and it's such a different way with each other. And there
Mm.
might be a lot of notes, but it's I think it's fun. I can't think of a
Mhm.
this lineup would be the ultimate lineup, but
Yeah.
I
I mean, it
enjoyed
sounds
the short run we did in Japan.
we'd. I mean, that's something. I don't have an insight into the viability of this, but that lineup you mentioned is something we'd love to see. To over here in the West, that would be super cool. But also, we'd love to see
Yeah.
Marty on Joe if you're listening. If you're listening, we'd love to see Marty on some stuff like that. Speaking of touring, we'll make this the last thing. You are planning on touring certainly in the US. Can you tell us a little bit about the tour plans for this album going forward and where folks can see you? Because we'd love to see this stuff live. What do you
We
have in the
just did a
works?
short we just did a very short tour of America, um, and with my good friend John Five, which was having him on a G3 type of thing would be awesome.
Mm,
Super, super player and super dude. Um, but as of right now, we're only gonna do the only thing that are etched in stone right now are two festivals in Asia and a show in Tokyo, and we're gonna plan to do the proper drama tour at the end of this year and more next year. So building up into that drama tour is what we're going to do. A lot of the prep for that and a lot of events and promotional things over this year. Drama is going to hopefully, open a lot of new doors and stuff because the style of it is lends itself to a lot of things that we're talking about in the planning stages now. So, but there's nothing that I love more than touring. So we're going to get everywhere, Europe, UK, America, South America, and all that stuff. So
well,
please follow any of the social network stuff for the latest info on that, but definitely not going to skip touring.
superb. I mean, that's what we wanted to hear. Ultimately, it was kind of a very roundabout and very selfish way of me saying, "Are you going to come and play in the UK? And can I come and watch?" So we'll be sure to be there,
Absolutely.
100%. Marty,
Absolutely.
I want to thank you so much for being so generous with your time, and it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. Super insightful into your process making the album, into your guitar playing. It's been a dream. Thank you so much for doing this, guys. Nick Jensen for Guitar Interactive Magazine. Marty, anything you'd like to say in parting to our viewers?
Yeah, thank you very much, Nick, and thank you for your informed conversation. It's very nice that you listen to everything and listen to it with a very informed ear and educated ear. I really appreciate it a lot.
Oh, well, that is super kind of you, man. You've made my day. Okay, that's going on my CV along with Marty Friedman said turn up. Thanks,
Turn it
Marty.
up, man. Turn it up.
Wise
Thanks,
words.
Nick. Take care.
Pleasure. Thank you so
Take
much.
care, brother.